let's complete our process implementation by adding the process context and implementing the gateway. So as you can see, we have our separate activities, but there's no link with the process context yet. So we can define a process context by going to data types. We select the BPS rec customer data element and we drag it onto the process canvas. So now this data type can be used to pass data between the process and its activities. We will also need the context of the WebDimpro component to retrieve the approved element. So we also add that to our process context. Now we're going to do a mapping from the process context to the human activity and back from the human activity to the process context. So we select the human activity, we select input mapping, and now we map the process context elements to the inputs of the check customer details human activity. So after this is done, we also have to define the mapping from the human activity back to the process context. Therefore we select output mapping, we go to task output UI response, and we want to drag the approved element to our process context. We save it, and now this mapping is our key. You have to do the same thing for the automated activity, providing only the input mapping. And then finally we're going to implement our gateway. So we select it, go to properties, and here we see our two branches, approved and rejected. Rejected, we select this branch as a default gate, and then we're going to edit the condition for the approved branch. So when will the approved branch be called? If the approved element is filled up with the value approved. So therefore we will use a matches function. So first we select the function, then we select the process context element, approved, and this has to match the string approved for the approved branch to be selected. So after we save, we see that our process model is now complete. To finish the implementation of our SAP Netweaver BPM process, we're going to create a startup service. Previously we defined the process context and we defined a binding between this process context and the automated and the human activity. The only thing that's missing now is a binding between the parameters of the start event and the process context. For this we will create our own startup web service with the right import parameters, and afterwards create the binding. So we can see in the start event that it is associated with a default service interface and an empty operation. We can see that the process context holds data about person, physical address, in email and so on, and that the context of the default service is empty. So therefore we create now our own service interface. You just leave the defaults as they are and click finish. This generates a WSDL file. As you can see, there's already one import element called in. We can change this element to the elements we need in our process. So after we save this, we go back to our start event and go to the service interface of this start event. We now select our newly created service interface and perform a mapping between the elements of this service interface and our process context. So now our startup service will be called with some import parameters which will be passed to our process. Next thing we have to do is build our process and afterwards deploy it. After deployment, we're still gonna have to do some configuration. Therefore, we navigate to the NetWeaver administrator, select SOA management, application and scenario communication, and business scenario communication. What we want to do is link our service group for the automated activity with a provider system, this on the consumer side, and then on the provider side select a service that is associated with the consumer side. So now we add our service group. And we assign it a provider system. After that, we add the service interface. From our CAF project. We click finish, and now we're ready to test the application.